Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thanks once again to all of you for coming to this ASPI event. We really couldn't be more timely in terms of speaker and topic. This is an issue which is customarily hotting up on its 36-month cycle of hotness, and I suspect we're only going to hear even more as we get seriously into the election campaign. I was just given an ABC News article titled, released at 5 minutes to 5 this evening, Manus Island Detention Centre to be shut, PNG Prime Minister Peter O'Neill says. So I imagine our speakers had a pretty busy day reacting to the range of issues which have been playing out in the media. Richard Marles is going to talk to us about offshore processing and the urgent need for third country resettlement. Richard will be known to many of you, I'm sure. He's been the member for Corio since November 2007. Corio covers Geelong and the Bellarine Peninsula. He has been Shadow Minister for Immigration and Border Protection from 2013 through to now. Commendable stability and job, Richard, I'd have to say. And many of you will remember him for a range of ministerial and parliamentary secretary roles which he played in the previous government, most particularly Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs and also for Pacific Island Affairs. And Richard has had a very deep and long-lasting professional and personal interest in the Pacific Islands, which has been commendable and is important and necessary, and a great shame we don't have more parliamentarians that have taken the interest that you have. So you're very welcome. It's great to have you here in what I know will be a busy week and a busy few months coming up for you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please welcome Richard Marles.
Well, thank you, PJ, for that introduction. Yes, there has been stability, which is in the way in which we've held this portfolio, which has been a good thing for most. It has resulted in a number of nervous ticks on my part, and I'm not sure my family are so happy about it. But it has been. It was an area that I actually sought to do. It was a portfolio I asked for. I've got to say there was not a large queue of people in front of me. But it has been, it is an enormously interesting area, and obviously one of significant importance for our country, and a debate which I think has been a pretty toxic debate over the years, which needs resolution, and I'll talk more about that at the end. But let me start by saying that offshore processing is probably the single most important policy that has been introduced by an Australian government that has brought to an end, we hope, the journey between Java and Christmas Island, and as a result brought to an end the tragedy that we saw unfold on those waters. From the time that offshore processing was introduced in the form of the regional resettlement arrangement by Kevin Rudd through the negotiations with PNG and Nauru, we saw an immediate drop-off in the flow of asylum seeker vessels by something like 90% over a 2-month period. And it stayed at that level throughout the rest of 2013 without there being a single policy step taken by the then Abbott government until the end of 2013, which was when they first started to turn back boats. So what we can take from that is that 90% of the work in terms of seeing an end to the flow of boats between Java and Christmas Island was done by the policy of offshore processing. And we are deeply committed to it. We are deeply committed to it because of the role that it plays in saving lives. But we comprehended offshore processing as a system of processing with people ultimately being resettled. We did not comprehend it as a form of indefinite detention, as has played out in effect on Manus, or indefinite limbo, which is how it has played out in relation to Nauru. And the fact that we have seen no resolution of the fate of those on Manus and Nauru in a meaningful way over the last 3 years puts enormous pressure on that system. And that's been building for months now. years, really. And so the events that have played out over the course of the last 24 hours, at one level, are not a surprise. And one thing is completely clear to me. This is a very serious moment in the policy area of asylum seekers and offshore processing. How the government handles this will tell in large measure the story of the future of offshore processing, obviously, but of the asylum seeker policy and being able to maintain a policy which sees the end of that terrible journey being maintained. This decision of the Supreme Court and now the Prime Minister of PNG cannot become a green light for the revival of the journey between Java and Christmas Island. It must not become that. And frankly, the Minister in the last 24 hours has been silly in pretending that, to begin with, this decision was not a major moment. And there can only be one place for the Minister to be right now, and that is PNG. To suggest that this decision is not significant is, for anybody who's followed this issue, clearly placing your head in the sand. It is a difficult predicament, to be sure. But the starting point of this predicament has been the failure of the government in finding options for those on Manus and Nauru. In respect of Manus, it was imagined by us that the vast majority of people would be processed and resettled within 12 months. The original agreement that was signed back in 2013 was for 12 months. We're talking about hundreds of people, not thousands. That ought to have been manageable. But this government, when it came to power, effectively dropped that ball. It was months before there was a meaningful conversation between the then Minister Scott Morrison and his counterpart in PNG around the critical question of resettlement. It was not until after the tragedy of Reza Barati that you saw a process being initiated between the two governments around this question. And it's not a matter for PNG to initiate this. It is a matter for Australia. We must always bear in mind that PNG came to our aid and our assistance in respect of this. This was always an issue which had to be driven at the Australian end, and that would be the expectation between both countries. Letting it sit was never good enough, and there were lost months associated with that. PNG does have opportunities for a number of the people who are in this facility to build their lives, as thousands of Australians have chosen to pursue their fortune in PNG. There are opportunities in that country, but that has not been pursued under this government. But perhaps more significantly, there has been a failure to negotiate third country resettlement at a global level. And that is fundamentally a function of this government having turned its back on the global community at a time of the world's greatest humanitarian need since the Second World War. The UNHCR tells us that there are near 60 million people displaced in the world today, with Syria being the biggest issue, which has given rise to a displacement of people, but that in combination with old conflicts such as occurring in Somalia, in combination with what we see in northern Nigeria with Boko Haram, with what we see in Yemen, all of that is giving rise to the biggest humanitarian need since the Second World War. And it's at that moment that on the election of the Turnbull Abbott government, we saw Australia cut its funding to the UNHCR, cut its humanitarian intake, and make very clear that it was not going to listen to any advice from Geneva, but was going to make its decisions solely in Canberra. It was a remarkable contribution, that statement. I mean, of course, we make decisions in Canberra about what Australia does as a nation, and that is obviously expected from those in Geneva. But the point of making that comment to the UNHCR was in effect to send a message of isolationism. It was to demean the role that the UNHCR plays. It was in essence turning our back on the world at a point in time when the world had its greatest need. And yet, when you think about the essence of offshore processing and what we seek to do there, we are asking help from the rest of the world in respect of an issue that we are seeking to deal with. A regional issue, to be sure, but we are seeking the assistance of other countries in the world, even if that is solely PNG and Nauru. But it needs, of course, to be more than that. So it shouldn't be a surprise to the government that at a time when it turned its back on the world was turning its back on it. And that is why the government has struggled to find meaningful third country resettlement options. That is why the government has, in a sense, been condemned to scratching around in places like Cambodia, trying to build resettlement systems from scratch. And what we've seen there is the expenditure of $55 million in respect of 2 or 3 people, ultimately, which is nothing other than an expensive joke. But it ought to have been clear from the outset that to try and build a resettlement capability within a country like Cambodia from scratch was going to require an enormous expenditure, a significant amount of time, and would never be a genuine answer to the needs and the fate of those who are on Manus and Nauru right now. It was a botched attempt. It wasted valuable time. It obviously wasted a whole lot of money. Now, at our national conference last year, we articulated a different approach. An approach where Australia would stand up and play the role that you would expect us to play as a modern, progressive, liberal democracy, a country which has been a bastion of human rights, a country which was one of the founders of the UN Convention on Refugees, that we would play a role which would meet the expectations that go with that history. And so we proposed a transformational commitment to the UNHCR, $450 million over the course of the forward estimates, an amount of money which would have made Australia one of the top 5 contributors, or would make Australia one of the top 5 contributors to the UNHCR, punching above our weight. We announced that we would double our humanitarian intake over the course of the next 10 years to 27,000 people. Think about that. 27,000 people each and every year. Now, at the height of perhaps our greatest moment in terms of providing humanitarian redress for people around the world, which was the Fraser government in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, we talk about 50,000 people. We're talking about doing that every 2 years, every 2 years. It's an enormous commitment. We made a commitment that we would play a leadership role in Southeast Asia, not just in terms of combating transnational crime, which, to be fair to the government, is something that has been pursued by them, but in terms of building a humanitarian space. And that is of enormous interest to the UNHCR, and we made it clear that we would restore references to the UN Convention on Refugees in our Migration Act. Critically important in terms of our own domestic regime. Now, all of that is a package of measures which says that Australia is back playing its part. And I have no doubt that were we to do that, and were we to be a part of the global community, that there would then be options presented to us in terms of finding realistic, genuine, third country options for those on Manus and Nauru. And we made it clear then, as we've been making it clear ever since, that resolving the fate of those on Manus and Nauru would be absolutely core business for a future Labor government. But the entry to being able to do that is to rejoin the global community, to go to Geneva, to speak with the UNHCR and to make peace. And frankly, that's what the federal government ought to be doing right now. It's what the federal government should have done from the very start. Instead, I think there has been almost this sense that those on Manus and Nauru can be made an example of as a form of deterrence for any others who would seek to make that journey. Now, that is a moral space that we never entered. We were never in the moral space of doing harm to anybody in pursuit of whatever objective. We saw offshore processing as being about taking Australia off the table. It was not about making an example of any group of people. The vast majority of those on Manus and Nauru today have been found to have been genuine refugees. In that sense, they're worthy. And we do need to ensure that their fate is resolved. And it is not an appropriate moral stance to see them as being some kind of example which acts as a deterrent for others. That's not how it ought to work. But quite apart from the moral question of how that should play, there has been a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of the government about how this works in a systemic sense. If you don't have people being processed, if you do not have people ultimately being resettled, then you do not have a flow through Nauru and PNG. You have an indefinite situation, and that is not sustainable. The events of the last 24 hours are bearing that out. So whatever one's moral frame in relation to this, just in terms of the initial objective of bringing an end to that journey in a sustainable way, it was always critical that there be resettlement options for those on Manus and Nauru. In that, the government has completely failed. Now, this whole question is, in my mind, an example of a bigger point. This is difficult. This is difficult, complex policy. It is the kind of policy that needs to be approached in Australia by all parties doing their best to be on the same page. This is an area of policy which ought to be bipartisan. Whatever your view about the size of government, be it big or small, whatever your view about the way market economies work and the role of government in terms of softening the edges of that, whatever your view about trade unions, all the sorts of issues which have been the dividing lines between the major parties in Australia from the time of federation, none of that has a bearing on the way in which you view this question. It's just difficult. That's all you can say. It is difficult. And it's difficult because there are, according to the UNHCR, 10 million people in the world today who are genuine refugees seeking permanent resettlement, and yet the resettlement community offers about 100,000 places, 1% of the demand. And so the question that no one wants to think about, which is what underpins this in the most difficult way, is who do we say no to, in what circumstances do we say no, and how do we do that? I mean, really, if you analyse even the Greens' policy, as uncosted as it is, they are saying the same thing. But unless you address that issue, you cannot build fairness and justice into a policy, a serious policy offering on the part of government. So this is hard. It ought to be done in a bipartisan way. And yet what we have in its place is a toxic debate. And in truth, since the modern incarnation of this issue, it has always been toxic. I think where we are now, the modern incarnation of the asylum seeker debate began with the Howard government's handling of the boarding of the Tampa. We can really date the fracturing in this debate to that time. And whilst, of course, there was a policy dimension to the way in which that was handled, unquestionably there was also an enormous political dimension. A government at the time that was struggling, which saw in this issue an opportunity to revive its stocks, and doing so, I might say, by appealing to the darkest angels of people's nature. And that kind of politics has been played by the coalition ever since. And it is as alive today as it was then. And on the other side of the debate, on the humanitarian side, no matter how well-intentioned people are, and they are very deeply well-intentioned and come to this with enormous passion about the issue, often what we see is ill-informed comment, and sometimes it is worse than that. And I think particular examples of that where you look at the way in which those voices characterise Manusians and Nauruans in ways which, frankly, border on the bigoted. I mean, I heard comments from people today describing Manus and Manusians in a way which invited us to think that this was a violent people which gave rise to a very dangerous place. And yet anyone who has been to Manus knows that it is exactly the opposite, which is the case. Manus is a peaceful place. It is a peaceful place. And the Manusians are not a violent people. And what we see in this debate is a shocking exaggeration and generalisation which, were it made in any other context, would be regarded as utterly unacceptable. And yet we see it made here. It's just another day at the office in terms of this debate. And the same is said of Nauruans. We have heard extraordinary comments, or I have at least, in forums around the country where there's almost a sense that every Nauruan male is a rapist. Clearly wrong. Clearly wrong. And were you to make that comment in any other context, it would be seen as totally unacceptable here. It is just another day at the office. This is a terrible and toxic debate, and it has to be resolved. So let's be frank about this debate. This debate since 2001 and this issue, if we're looking at it in real political terms, has played very well for the Liberals, and it has played very well for the Greens. It has played not at all for Labor. And you have seen both the Greens and the Liberals since 2001 exploit this debate in a cynical and political way. There's no better example of that than what we saw with the Malaysian arrangement. Let's think about Malaysian arrangement. It was an attempt by the government of the day to come up with an innovative solution, which many experts in this field think would have been the best opportunity at the time in actually bringing an end to that journey between Java and Christmas Island, and it was stopped by an alliance between the Liberals and the Greens. And no one listening to the way in which the Liberals talk now could possibly believe the rationale that was used then for their opposition to the Malaysian arrangement. Thousands of people came to Australia by boat after the Malaysian arrangement was ditched. Hundreds of people died. The politics of burying that agreement was absolutely appalling, and it was solely a political decision. And it is emblematic of how toxic and how destructive this debate has been for the Australian national interest. But that continues to this day. We heard this morning, or maybe this afternoon, in a press conference by the Minister, an announcement that national security, this issue, would be sought to be made a key election issue at this debate, at this election. Now, the Minister has rightly said that people smugglers listen intently to every word that is said in the Australian discourse around this issue. And they do. When you are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars being at stake in every journey, as was the case when the journeys were occurring, of course those who are promoting those journeys are going to look at this with all the forensic interest that you would expect anyone dealing with a business of that kind to engage in. They listen to every word that is said here, and the Minister was right when he made that point. But on repeated occasions, in the Parliament, in the media, in his press conference this afternoon, the Minister has also made it clear that if Labor were to be re-elected, the boats would start again, that you cannot trust Labor. Now, I ask you to think about that. I ask you to think about that in the context of a person who has made it absolutely clear that people smugglers listen to every word he says. If there was a clearer invitation on the part of this government to people smugglers to get ready in the event of a Labor win, I haven't heard it. It is an absolutely appalling and cynical thing to say. And in truth, to seek to make this an issue at this election is a cynical and appalling thing to do. It is fine to go out there and say that you seek to act in the national interest, and they are, the government, the great saviours of the Australian national interest when it comes to this question. And that you have to be careful about what you say, except when it's in the coalition's electoral interest domestically. And the willingness to sacrifice Australia's national interest in pursuit of that is breathtaking. But that is what we have seen. Now, in defence and in foreign affairs, we have a bipartisanship, by and large. It's not that there isn't criticism, of course there is. But when either party seeks to criticise the government of the day, in that space, they tread carefully and they tread warily, because the essential politics of defence and foreign affairs is this. The party which seeks to go out and politicise those areas of policy at the expense of the national interest will be the parties which are subject of the greatest public criticism, and particularly by the national security community. And so we all work together. Criticism is made, it is made very carefully, and the national interest is kept preeminent, and politics is rarely played. That has to become the case in respect of the asylum seeker debate and in respect of immigration. It simply must become that case. And so it is therefore incumbent on the national security community to criticise those who seek to politicise this. And so when you hear the Minister going out there and saying that if Labor's elected, the boats will start again, and when you hear him say that, knowing, as I'm sure people in this room do, the process that we went through at our national conference last year, a sober, a detailed, a heart-wrenching debate to make it clear that we would never go there again, where we changed our position to make sure that it accorded with the national interest. When you hear the Minister seek to dismiss all of that and make this a political issue, understand what he's doing by his own standards in terms of the message that he's broadcasting to people smugglers and the degree to which he is willing to ditch the national interest in pursuit of the government's own political interests. We seek to approach this area of policy in a sober way. Our national conference last year was the best example of that. We do acknowledge fault on the part of Labor and government, and we've been very clear about that. And we do acknowledge success in policy on the part of the government, and we've been clear about that as well. But any analysis of the history of this which suggests that all the fault lies on one side and all the credit lies on the other is frankly ridiculous. And there is not a person who has been involved in this in an operational or policy sense within the bureaucracy who believes that for a second. We all know it's difficult. We all know mistakes have been made on both sides, and we all know that contributions have been made on both sides, which have led us to a very good place where we are not seeing people drowning on our borders in the numbers as they were. That's how it should be. And our willingness to call it as it is, to acknowledge our failings, to acknowledge our strengths as well, and to acknowledge where the government's got it right and where it's got it wrong, we see as being our entry card to a new bipartisanship in respect of this issue. To a new debate, a mature debate, a debate which sees this as an issue which is dealt with in the national interest. And it is now incumbent upon Malcolm Turnbull's coalition to do the same, and if he does not do so, then he deserves the absolute criticism of the Australian people. Thank you for having me tonight.
Richard, thank you very much. I think the words that I heard there were a toxic discussion, and that's something certainly I've been struck with in my time in Australia so far. Difficult, complex policy issue. I think sometimes it must feel, quite a thankless task in grappling with this discussion, and I think your words showed a mature understanding, to use your own words, of historically where the debates come from and the way that you're thinking about it. I was struck by one point when you were outlining your discussions at the National Conference last year. Those sound like really good long-term goals, but obviously, we can't escape. And I'm not able to escape the fact that this often does become a heavily politicised discussion in this country. So, I was interested just to push you further on that, and in the kind of turbulent political cycle we're in here, should Labour come to power, are there kind of three quick steps that you think you would look to take in order to, not so much to differentiate yourself, but if you like, to make progress in those longer-term goals that you've set yourself?
Well, firstly, this is a policy issue, and it has been an issue of the debate. Both the policy needs to be managed, but the debate needs to be managed. In respect of the debate first, we have sought to deal with this absent of politics as much as it is possible for us to do that. We have tried to go back to first principles, to understand what is, if you like, the issue that makes this complex. And it ultimately is the fact that there are far more people out there in the world today who are deserving and who are worthy than we can provide places for. And we're not talking about a marginal difference. We're talking about the fact that what we provide is 1% of the global demand. That is difficult. And so we talk in terms of what are the ethics, the values that are going to drive us in the decisions in this complex area that we make. We've articulated them as fairness, as generosity, compassion. And in doing that, we then say, what is our mission statement as a country? And we talk about the need to make decisions which reduce the sum of global human misery, knowing that we're not going to remove global human misery, but we seek to make decisions which reduce the sum of global human misery, and that along the way we will never make decisions which harm people. Now, we have sought, using that which I would describe as an ethical framework, to make our decisions and to make our arguments. And we've kind of been fanatic about basing all our debate in that context, so that it is not the kind of political, the worst of politics that we've seen since 2001. In terms of so that's the debate. In terms of the policy, what would we actually do in coming to government? There are a number of things which need to be done. The first thing, I'm not sure it's three, but the first thing we do need to do is re-enter the global community. And I gave you a sense of how we'd do that. Getting to Geneva quickly, making it clear that we are back as part of the global family in dealing with humanitarian need is critical. Changing rhetoric, but increasing our funding to the UNHCR, increasing our humanitarian intake, and providing leadership within our region, which is what the UNHCR want. All of that is really critical, and getting to the UNHCR quickly and making it clear that that's what we would seek to do is paramount. I think if you were to look at kind of core legacy issues that would be in existence on the 2nd of July. Well, obviously, the fate of those on Manus and Nauru is central to that. And I think finding resolution to their fate as quickly as possible is really urgent. As I articulated, getting to Geneva is actually part of doing that. Having people in that state of limbo and uncertainty for the period of time that has occurred now will have wrought an enormous amount of damage on those people, and there is a great urgency to deal with it. But as we've seen in the last 24 hours, it places pressure on the very system and what it's trying to do. So that is a critical component in relation to this as well. And a third thing, I think, which is kind of the forgotten area here, there remain about 30,000 people in Australia who are not being processed, or they are being processed, but very slowly. That needs to speed up. And we need to have their fate resolved as quickly as possible, in the knowledge that what we do in respect of those people actually doesn't have a bearing on the journey between Java and Christmas Island. No one seriously thinks that whether there are temporary protection visas or permanent protection visas plays any bearing at all in whether or not this journey continues. What changed things in terms of the people smugglers model was offshore processing and boat turnbacks. It was not temporary protection visas. And so getting that architecture into a place where people who are in Australia, their fate can be resolved as quickly as possible would be important too.
Jim.
Richard, hi, Jim Molan.
Jim.
Thank you for that. That was great. And I've certainly admired much of what you've said over the last couple of years in relation to this. And as someone who was involved in this from the start, could I just ask you to be a little bit more specific, please? It's okay to look for solutions in opposition, but then it's very hard often to find those solutions in the reality, particularly if the main focus is on the UNHCR. And would you bring those on Manus back to Australia now, or would you leave them there until you find this third country solution that you've been talking about through the UNHCR or through ever? And if not, is this not a moral decision along of similar proportion, if you don't bring them to Australia, of similar proportion to what you've criticised the Libs for?
Well, first of all, you don't escape any decision in this space without there being a moral dimension to it. I don't think I've come across an area of policy before where so often you are literally asked to make decisions which are about life and death, and it's because somebody who in my previous role spent a lot of time travelling through the third world, and I know people in this room have done that. Life is dramatically different. Living in countries such as those, the subject of persecution compared to what life offers here in Australia. And people will risk their lives in getting from one place to the next. And so the whole space, which in a sense is on the border of those things, becomes constantly a question of life and death, and morals therefore are at the heart of it. But it's why, if we're to have a proper kind of ethical debate about this, there does need to be some beginning philosophical discussion about what it is that we're trying to do. And that's why we went back and did that original groundwork. We seek to reduce the sum of global human misery. Now, when people are drowning on our border in the number that they were, I don't think as a country we could hand on heart say that in terms of the way we were interacting with the world's displaced, that we were reducing the sum of global human misery. We may well have been adding to it. But equally, keeping people, near 2,000 people, in a state of indefinite limbo, that is not reducing the sum of global human misery either. That is destroying people's lives. That is making it worse. It is, by that ethical standard, if you like, incumbent upon us to resolve their fate, but to do so in a way which doesn't harm others. There isn't an easy answer here. You can't disconnect the two because they are deeply connected. Offshore processing was put in place to bring an end to that journey, and as I articulated at the outset, it's probably the single most important step an Australian government has made. Whatever you do in respect of that cohort is going to have an impact on whether or not people smugglers start operating, and whether people end up on those boats, and whether people start drowning again. So the notion that you sometimes hear from some groups that you can kind of just make a decision in isolation here, and that you don't take responsibility for the consequences over here, even if that results in people dying. Well, there's nothing moral about that. To go to the specifics, it is actually impossible to answer your question in relation to what the fate of those people should be given the events of the last 24 hours. What I know is this. It must be up front and centre in the mind of the government right now to ensure that the events in PNG over the last 24 hours do not become a green light for the revival of the journey between Java and Christmas Island. Given the role that offshore processing has played, it is self-evident that every effort must be made to see that what offshore processing was intended to do can continue. If it was me, I'd be in PNG right now. I mean, I know the country reasonably well. It was totally obvious to me from the moment that decision was handed down yesterday that there could be only one place for the minister concerned to be, and that's in Port Moresby. I think that's borne out now by the statement that the Prime Minister of PNG made this afternoon. And we need to be there, not demanding of PNG that they do a whole lot of things, but acknowledging the fact that it was PNG who came to our aid and our assistance. We asked them to help us out, and that has to be the basis on which we conduct our discussions with PNG. And that's actually a critical point here in terms of how the relationship with PNG ought to be managed and how it has been managed. The answer to your question then obviously flows from what is the outcome of those conversations. Now, those conversations can't wait till the 2nd of July. They need to be happening right now. And what we would do on the 2nd of July is, it's not the most satisfactory answer, but it's just the truth. It's totally dependent on what the government manages to do over the next 2 months. But what I do know is there is an enormous amount at stake here. And it is really the sorts of options that are talked about would have very significant consequences if offshore processing is not allowed to continue. I don't want it to be a surprise to anyone. I mean, it was the decision which made the difference. If you reverse the decision, you can expect a consequence as a result. And to think anything else is simply not to have your eyes open to what we are dealing with here. And to say, as the Minister said today, that this kind of almost is irrelevant, Australia's got its policy and that's mine, I mean, it's ridiculous. This policy is based on a partnership between two countries, and when you're in a partnership, it involves a mutual exchange. It's not entirely up to us. It is about a discussion with PNG, which is why that discussion should be happening right now. So, I mean, that, from where I sit, with the knowledge that I have, that's the best answer I can give you, but I know what I'd be doing very differently to Peter Dutton right now.
Anthony Bergen from ASPI. Maybe I could ask Kim's question in a slightly different way, but I think it's probably getting to the same point. Whose responsibility is it for these people? Is it Australia's responsibility, or does the agreement whereby we transfer them to Marles, does it give responsibility to the Papua New Guinea government for these people? Whose responsibility is it ultimately, the fate of these people?
Look, there's a legal answer to that, and there's a kind of moral answer to that, there's a practical answer to that. So let's just deal with the moral and practical dimension to it. Australia obviously has a responsibility to resolve the fate of these people. Australia obviously has that responsibility. I mean, we've been making that clear from the moment we have been talking about this, and the government say they are busily talking to third countries to find other options, so presumably they see it as their responsibility as well. Under the agreement, we were working in partnership with PNG, but it's obviously our responsibility to resolve the fate of these people. And we do not resolve the question of a sustainable answer to seeing an end to the journey between Java and Christmas Island unless we discharge that responsibility and actually find resettlement options for these people so that the processing centres are processing centres and not places of indefinite detention. Now, that is the practical answer to the question. I think, you know, what exists is an agreement between two countries which, you know, share responsibilities, and of course the facility sits within PNG, and in many respects there is a whole lot of sovereignty that they exercise over the facility, which is the other point. The notion that you could sit back today and say, look, you know, this decision doesn't bind Australia. I mean, the decision does bind the PNG government in respect of how it deals with the facility in PNG. That obviously has an impact on Australia. I mean, it is one of the most daft comments I've ever heard. And it's the comment of somebody who absolutely has their head in their sand. Like, we are in a partnership with PNG, and this government need to understand it. And we ask them for their help. And the notion that you can dictate terms is totally wrong and will lead to, you know, botching this up, which is where this seems to have landed. And the consequences of that are potentially severe. So the answer to your question is Australia has a responsibility to resolve the fate of these people. Our view was that the point of offshore processing was to take Australia off the table. So a resolution of their fate can't be here, because if it is, you're not taking Australia off the table. But you need to actively resolve their fate. But the government needs to actively resolve their fate.
So, Richard, we're going to be pretty soon into a caretaker period, which has got a different set of obligations and requirements both on government and opposition. Will you go up to Port Moresby during that period to talk to them about what a shortened government might do if it wins the election? And you touched in your comments on a line which said, you know, there are things that people could do in PNG which could create, you know, economic useful lives for themselves if they chose to take those options up. For some, yeah. I mean, do you have any ideas about what an Australian government might be able to do that could perhaps try to generate more of that sort of outcome in the PNG context?
Yeah. Let me deal with that part first. It is right that PNG, this is the first, or will be, or actually the accurate way to describe this has initiated for the first time a process by which PNG has resettled refugees. And actually, by virtue of what's occurred, they've adopted a resettlement policy which applies beyond the question of those within the Manus facility and more generally those coming to PNG. And so, for example, there is a number of people on the border with Indonesia from West Papua who have been in PNG for a long time, and they've determined a policy which will apply to them. But the point I'm really making is that in terms of a history of resettlement, PNG is right at the start. We have been resettling people for a very long period of time. We do it very well. We are acknowledged globally for that. But I don't think there's anybody who's involved in the resettlement process in Australia who would say that this is a skill that can be acquired overnight. There are among those on Manus people with skills, with education, who would be able to find opportunity in terms of employment and a life in PNG and as a Papua New Guinean. I'm sure of that. There are also people who are more vulnerable, if I can put it that way, within the facility where it really is going to require a kind of resettlement capacity such as we understand it in Australia to help them out. And I don't think it is going to be possible for PNG to work with those people. So, ultimately, Australia absolutely has a role to play, and part of the agreement was that we would support PNG in the way in which it practically managed the resettlement of people. But I think at the end of the day, whilst PNG can be the basis upon which many could be resettled, it's not going to be the answer for everyone. In terms of, but I suppose the short answer to your question is, Australia definitely has a role to play, and it is part of the agreement with PNG that we play this role to support PNG in terms of the resettlement of people. And that involves financially supporting. In terms of caretaker, look, the government remains the government of the day until the next government is sworn in. Foreign governments aren't about to start dealing with members of the opposition even during a caretaker period. Of course, we would expect that during caretaker periods there'd be greater briefings of us, greater consultation with us about the way in which the government acts. But the government needs to act on this, and it needs to act on it now. But another point I'd make, PJ, is again, knowing PNG, the land of the unexpected, and how quickly things move there, if there is a sense in the government that this matter can wait until we go into caretaker, which one would expect is still probably the better part of 2 weeks away, they just got it wrong. Things move quickly. Peter Dutton should be there now. He should have been on the first plane this morning. And they need to be talking with the government of Papua New Guinea right now. And it's important he's there, to be honest, to demonstrate the significance of this matter to Australia and to have somebody of authority in the country who can put on the table the sorts of issues and deal with them so that this can be resolved very quickly. It's inept, what we've seen. It really is. At a really critical moment. And it betrays a totally flawed understanding of PNG and our relationship with PNG.
I wonder if I could push you on something that you were talking about at the end. And I think you made an admirable call for bipartisanship on this issue. And I look around the world and look at how I wonder how plausible that is. I look at how the US election seems to be one of the centre grounds is around immigration issues and the way it's polarising opinion. I look at the way the recent UK election was fought on similar grounds and it polarised opinion there. It clearly is an election issue for the voting public. How do you then create that bipartisanship which then cements also the public's view on this? I think that balance is incredibly difficult, more so than most other national security issues or defence issues.
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair call, and I think you're right about it. But everyone in this room has a role to play in that as well. I like the commentary of this debate. But the pressure needs to be applied on the participants in the political space that there is an expectation that this will be played out absent of politics and in the national interest. Now, of course, you can say that about any area of policy, but the two political parties have roughly defined views about economics, which create an important difference and a debate within our society that matters. And you expect the parties to contest that and to provide choices to the Australian people about which way to vote. But as I said at the outset, when you think it through, the kind of issues that divide Labor and Liberal ought not pertain to how we engage in respect of this. Well, I'm really happy to say that I think that the golden age of Australian immigration policy came under Malcolm Fraser, under a coalition government. I'm quite happy to say that you can find pretty bad history in terms of Labor since Federation in respect of the immigration issue. So it's not, this ought to be an area where we can find bipartisanship. But since Labor moved away from the white Australia policy, since Whitlam on, we have sought to engage in this space in a different way on the basis of being an open country, in a non-discriminatory way, and as a country which plays its part in global affairs. And there would be plenty of Liberals that would have precisely the same view about the heritage of their party in respect of this issue as well. And all I know is that this debate it's torn at the fabric of multicultural Australia. And we've kind of got more at stake here than almost any other country in the world. Australia has a quarter of its population born outside of our border. In terms of that stat, we rank number 2 in the world behind Israel. We are more invested in the need to have a harmonious, multicultural society than almost any other country on the planet. And so we can least afford a highly politicised and charged debate which tears at the fabric of that. People who want to set up a boxing ring where we kind of have, two sides slugging it out, throwing sort of hashtag slogans on the one side and having, appeals to really dark motives on the other. None of that is good. And there's not going to be a glorious winner in that boxing match. There is only going to be a loser, and that will be the Australian public. So we have to move beyond this. And it does mean that there's got to be a demand made on politicians that there is an expectation of bipartisanship here. And there's no question that politicians have a key role to play in this. As I say, we seek to do it by starting again, by founding our arguments in this space, both based on an ethical framework as I've outlined today, and we see that as our entry card to a new debate. And we call on the government, the coalition, to do the same. But we need the pressure placed upon all of us by the public, and by the national security public at that. And it's very important that when you hear a rank appeal to politicisation of this issue, as we have seen occur in the last 24 hours on the part of the Minister, that he's called for it. He's called out on it, that he's called out on it. Against his own standard of not sending messages to people smugglers, he sent the worst message of all. It deserves to be condemned, and it must be. And so all of us have a role to get to that place.
Well, that's a pretty meaty and challenging set of issues that you've raised, Richard, and I haven't missed really what I take almost as a challenge to the think tank community that I hear from you to say that it's partly our job here to try and shape public debate in ways that produces the right policy outcomes for Australia. And I don't quite know what the right response is to that. I mean, I think you're right that in some ways we have allowed this to be a race to the bottom. Too much of what the nature of public commentary has been. So I appreciate that call. some points that you made that I think stand out for me in terms of your observations is, we are clearly dealing with what is fundamentally a broader refugee problem globally, and I don't think there have been adequate solutions to deal with that. I worry very much about the refugee camps on the borders of Syria now as being essentially a recruiting ground for radicalism, which is only going to become worse as people get more desperate in those situations. So I think part and parcel of the solution set that you talk about needs to include what we can do in those camps to prevent that type of thing from occurring. It's also probably seldom the case that moral and ethical issues rise so strongly and so quickly to the surface of public policy debates in Australia. We tend not to be like that. We're a sort of pragmatic people that are interested in solutions to fixed problems in the easiest possible way without really thinking through what those ethical dimensions are. And, I can only say I admire your sort of combination of calmness on the one hand and passion on the other about how you have to deal with this issue. It's just possible, I suppose, we'll find out soon enough that on the 6th or 7th of July you could wake up and be the Minister for Immigration in the Shorten government, and maybe you will be on the plane flying to Port Moresby pretty much immediately that situation arises. We won't know. We'll find that out over the next few months. It undoubtedly is going to be a debate which will, I think, become a large part of the political dialogue over that period, and I encourage you to keep to that theme of sensibleness and reasonableness and bipartisanship as you go. So it's been a fascinating evening. I'd invite you all to join us for a drink and a snack outside now, but can I ask you to thank Richard Marles and